Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on with our discussion in Unit 4, talking about political organizations of space. And today what we're going to be dealing with are the different forms of boundaries. And after we get done with the different forms of boundaries, we'll look at boundary disputes. But for this specific video, we're just going to be talking about the different types of boundaries. Now, as we were talking about in our previous, as we were discussing in our previous videos, we were talking about the importance of the nation state and the emergence of the nation state in our world. And one of the things I emphasized in one of the previous videos was the way in which the nation states interact with each other, and how this is kind of a new concept or a new idea when it comes to international relationships. And so an important part of that, of course, is going to be defining the area that the different states control. And that's going to be done by the creation of official boundaries. Now, when we look at boundaries, we may not think about them a whole lot because unless we cross an international boundary, a lot of times it's not anything that's going to be too readily apparent in our lives. Boundaries are hugely important for states and for states as far as when we talk about countries. Even if you're looking at the United States and you look at the 50 different states in the United States, they're very important for them. And then as well, same thing with cities and counties, because what boundaries are going to do is it's going to help the state define itself in terms of the amount of territory that it controls. The amount of territory that it controls, and also the people that are under its jurisdiction. We talked about the elements of what it means for a state to be independent and sovereign, and so of course it has to control territory, and then it also has to have a permanent population. So not only does it have to control those things in order to be considered a state, but you also think about all the things that territory and people bring as far as resources to the state. Of course, with territory, you have natural resources. You have things like water, you have networks of trade, you have minerals, you have maybe oil or gas deposits, or you have agricultural land. So all the things that territory is going to bring, but then people also are a resource. People provide taxes. People provide a workforce. People provide the administration in terms of who's going to work in the government, who's going to be a part of that infrastructure. It provides a defense in terms of the military. So people are also going to be very important, and it's important for the state to understand which people belong to it in terms of who does it have jurisdiction over, who is it in charge of, what laws are going to apply to those people, things like that. So understanding boundaries is going to be hugely important, especially with the way that we have improved technology and improved infrastructure that's going to allow the reach of government to be much further and much faster. In previous years, when you had kingdoms that were far-flung, empires that were far-flung, and it was difficult for the government really to establish control. You think of the United States and the American Revolution, difficult for the government to control. Boundaries, of course, were important, but people on the kind of the outskirts of the boundary were able to maybe bend and break the rules a little bit because of the lack of administrative oversight. Nowadays, with boundaries and with interaction between states, the understanding of boundaries is going to be very important. So when we talk about boundaries between states, we look at three different types of boundaries. We have what's called the geometric boundary, the physical, and the cultural boundary. The geometric boundary is the newest type of boundary as far as the most recently implemented and between states. Now, even though it's really the most recently implemented, in today's world it's going to be the most commonly used because of the nature and the way that boundaries are drawn up a lot of time, especially across space that might be sparsely inhabited. The physical and cultural boundaries are pretty common sense. They've been around for a long time. It's ways that people have separated themselves, really since civilization began, even maybe prior to civilization, when you had nomadic tribes wandering around. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So the first type of boundary we're going to look at is the geometric boundary. So when we're referring to the geometric boundary, we're talking about a boundary that is going to be based strictly off of lines of latitude and longitude. Maybe I should have brought that up first. But one of the interesting elements of the geometric boundary is it's really not going to run along the lines of any physical or cultural attribute of the landscape. Now, is it possible for a geometric boundary to maybe run along a river or run along some other natural boundary? Yeah, but that's not necessarily the main consideration. The main consideration is the line of latitude or longitude. And of course, it's also possible for a geometric boundary to be tied into, or at least the boundary can be partially geometric, it can be partially part of the natural landscape, the physical boundary. You think about the Rio Grande, partially geometric, the boundary between the United States and Mexico, partially part of the Rio Grande, partially a geometric boundary. So when we look at the geometric boundary, it makes sense, especially for areas that are sparsely inhabited. But the problem comes in when you look at a place like Africa, where you have a large number of geometric boundaries, and a lot of the boundaries drawn on the continent of Africa were established by European governments for their own purposes and the administration and the territories that they controlled. You look here at the map, and obviously not all the physical features are on there, but most of the boundaries in Africa were drawn geometrically, okay, without a whole lot of attention paid to either the physical landscape or the cultural landscape, which is shown very well in this map that was developed by Herm de Bly, and so he tried to map out where all the different cultural groups in Africa were, and you can see some of these dotted lines, and they show where the modern state boundaries of Africa are. And so it would be easy to understand why grouping some of these African tribes and ethnic groups together would not necessarily always be helpful, because a lot of these tribes and ethnic groups didn't necessarily get along, and that's why they were separated from each other. So you do have some issues sometimes when you create these geometric boundaries, especially when they're superimposed boundaries, or when they're boundaries, they're going to be superimposed on the landscape, when they're going to be enforced by an outside force, especially people who are not as familiar with the territory, maybe as the people who live there. Another good example of that is most of the western states in the United States. You see these nice square edges on some of the states, such as Colorado, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona. You see the nice straight edges on those states, and even in Texas, here in the Panhandle in Texas. And of course, those are not based on physical characteristics of land, but rather they were a part of the system the United States set up early on, as it was trying to establish control over those frontier areas and establish these new states. And so that's another good example of geometric boundaries. Physical boundaries are, I would think, be readily understandable and explainable. They're boundaries that are established along parts of the physical landscape. So really what we're doing is we're kind of incorporating the physical landscape into the boundaries that we've established. And this makes sense because physical features for thousands of years have created geographic separation between people. And so if the people are separated by a large geographic feature, whether it be a mountain range, a desert, a lake, a river, something like that, then those people are going to grow apart, and so they're going to see each other as separate. And so it makes sense that you could create an administrative boundary across that physical feature. And so here I have the Ohio River, which is established as a boundary between several states within the United States, between Ohio, West Virginia, Ohio and Kentucky, Indiana and Kentucky, Illinois and Kentucky. And so again, that's just, it's a large river. It creates good separation on the landscape. It creates good separation between the people groups, and so it's easy to distinguish. It's easy to see. It's easy for people to understand where that administrative boundary is going to be. And then lastly, we look at the cultural boundary. The cultural boundary is a boundary that is established around cultural groups. So what we have here is boundaries that are established based upon the location of cultural groupings of people. And where do we see that? Really most readily available, we see it in most parts of Europe. Obviously, after World War II, when we have the establishment of the idea of the nation state within Europe and other parts of the world, you begin to see the solidification of these state lines, and they're very readily seen between France and Germany, Belgium, the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland. And these are boundaries that are drawn based upon primarily where specific groups of people are going to be living, mainly that particular ethnic group. And of course, these cultural connections could be anything ranging from the language to the religion, the overall ethnicity of the people that are living in that particular area. And again, this is something that's relatively historic. People of specific ethnic groups have tended to live obviously in similar areas and wanted to control their own territory. Now, of course, the new element to that is the idea of the nation state and actually establishing the state around. But the cultural groups had tended to separate themselves out for a very long time anyway. And then, of course, we look at several states in Eastern Europe and in southeastern Europe along the Balkan Peninsula, and we look at the separation of states based upon the cultural group's idea of Balkanization. Another great example of states and borders and boundaries being established along cultural lines. The last type of, I guess not really a boundary, but political situation we'll look at in this session is what are called frontiers. Frontiers are much different from our hard and fast boundaries in that frontiers typically tend to be centers of dispute for the fact that they are, one, weakly inhabited, not a whole lot of people living there, and also, secondly, weakly controlled. And frontiers have always been areas kind of marginal importance. Well, I take that back, not even marginal importance, but they're kind of on the outskirts of the control of the country or the territory. In today's world, they tend to be places that are a little bit more difficult to get to because of some geographic separation. Some great examples of these frontiers that are creating some disputes. We have the Spratly Islands, currently being contested by the Chinese, as they say that they have control over it. Over the Spratly Islands, you see this small little set of islands here in the South China Sea. And then you have the dispute between the United Kingdom and Argentina over the Falkland Islands. The United Kingdom currently has control over it. And there are these areas that are, that number one, they're small, and so they don't have a whole lot of people living there. It's difficult to control because of the distance and the terrain. The Guardian had a good article that I was looking at here. You can see the distance between I guess I don't have a map, but you can see some elements of the Falkland Islands there. Really small. I had that infographic on the PowerPoint there in terms of the number of sheep. Sheep versus the people, 179,000 sheep to 2,932 people on the island. So small, sparsely inhabited, not very large in terms of land area. Far away from the United Kingdom, difficult for them to control. Now, of course, this idea of frontier is much different today. There aren't as many frontiers because of the reach of governments. Frontiers would have been a much more common thing, historically speaking. But again, we still have some of those ideas of frontiers today. And one other thing I almost forgot to mention were there's some great videos on some bizarre borders. CPG Gray has some great videos. These here. You also have this one here by Wonder Why. Talking about complex international borders. Those are some great videos. I have them linked up on my YouTube channel as well. You can check those out for some further explanations of some relatively crazy borders around the world. And before we end today, we have a quiz ferret. So our quiz ferret question for the day is: most states in Africa have what type of boundaries? And if you said geometric boundaries, you would be correct. So thanks, Quiz Ferret. We appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you back next time when we talk about different types of boundary disputes.